Yes, please pick up the report, otherwise I'll have to carry them back to France. As a French person, I'm very impressed that it's possible in a country like Norway to hold a conference entirely in English and not have simultaneous interpretation. In my country, it will probably be possible one day. Thank you very much for inviting me again. I remember addressing this audience 3 years ago, and 3 years ago we talked about the phenomenon that we call shifting wealth. As the State Secretary reminded us, we talk about the fact that the center of the global economy over the last few decades has been shifting from the west to the east and the south. And my point 3 years ago was to say that Africa was no stranger to this phenomenon and that shifting wealth created immense opportunities for the continent. It was, of course, the presence of China, but also the fact that India and a number of other emerging countries were now interested in Africa, not just to buy its materials, but also to invest there, to do trade and exchange ideas, develop new models. What I propose to you today is to maybe give you a bit of an update of that story. So on the two sides. First, an update on the global story of the shifting wealth phenomenon, and then focus on Africa to see what's in there. The link with your topic today is to show that, as the State Secretary reminded us, the job is not done. The shifting wealth phenomenon is here to stay, but we see that some countries are doing better than others. The Africa growth story has been documented, time and time again, in magazines, in reports. But we're starting to see the limits also of the current growth model. We see that growth is good, but it's not enough. So I want to give this to you as a broad picture to introduce your discussions, because I think that goes at the heart of what the purpose of development finance institutions like Norfunds are doing, which is to try and identify where the gaps are in order to make growth really a transformative process. I'm from the Development Center of the OECD. It's a bit special place in the organization that deals not with aid issues. That's the DAC, which a lot of you are familiar with, the Development Assistance Committee. We work alongside the DAC from a different angle. We look at public policies by emerging and developing countries. And that's why we've had a fruitful relationship with Norfund for years now, because I think we really see very well where they come from and where they're going in terms of plugging these holes of access to finance in particular and access to technology for local entrepreneurs to participate in this development process. So let's take stock of the emergence and convergence process. First, looking at this shifting wealth phenomenon. This is something that we just published. It's called Perspectives on Global Development, and it basically looks at this shifting wealth thing. What you see here is that the process we've been describing of rebalancing between the share of the world GDP held by emerging economies and that held by OECD is continuing. By the time I was addressing this conference last time, little did I know that the moment where the aggregated GDP of emerging economies, non-OECD countries, would be equal to that of OECD countries. And since then, of course, the gap has been widening. So it means that since 2010, approximately, the OECD members represent less than half of the world's GDP. And that's as you see, is continuing. Of course, this is mostly owed to China, and I remember, I don't know whether the person is still here today, but I remember someone made that comment in my presentation 2 years ago to say, you should not lump together all the bricks in one basket because they're very different. And China really is a different case from India and the others. And that's true. If you look at here, the growing share of the GDP, world GDP held by China, it is really the one that makes the big difference. India is there, Indonesia, the Russian Federation, Brazil in green, and that little tiny one here is South Africa. So the phenomenon is continuing. It's not only a matter of GDP, it's also seen as final consumption expenditure. You can see here the share of those BRICS economies rising. You can see also their share of gross capital formation, that is investment, growing. And here again, the difference between China and the others is extremely telling. So we're really now in a completely different world from the one we had in the 20th century. Let's look at other aggregates. Here is gross exports. So again, no surprise that China is taking the lion's share of this growing share of total export held by BRICS. Gross imports, here again, you see the Chinese performance, which is really impressive. Also in terms of inward FDI flow, so that's investment coming from the rest of the world to those countries. And interestingly, again, also in terms of investment from those countries to the world economy. And here you see that China, again, is a major investor, and so is Russia. So again, the shifting wealth phenomenon is continuing, not just in terms of GDP, but in many other respects. But this is the news. The news is the following. We've seen that over the last decade, the GDP of non-OECD countries has been growing faster than that of GDP of OECD countries. And the difference is the black line. So you can see over that decade that the gap between our growth and their growth, has been widening. Now, look at what's happened since the 2009 crisis. It's culminated here, because that year you had OECD countries going into recession and losing 3.4% of growth, while the rest of emerging economies was growing at 3.5. And since then, it's been going down. So that's the new phenomenon. There seems to be a sort of a slowdown in this process of convergence between emerging economies and OECD countries. So that's what this report is trying to look into, and we're going to try and see what is behind this. We've done a little exercise, which is not a forecasting exercise, so you shouldn't take these figures as a prediction of what's going to happen, but it gives us an idea of a possible scenario. On this axis, we have pictured the average annual GDP growth of all those countries. So the gray ones are the low-income countries. The blue ones here are the upper middle income, and you have one high income, which is Russia. So this is the pace at which they've been growing between 2000 and 2012. Here, we have plotted the average growth that they would be needed from now on, from 2012 to 2050, if they were to reach average OECD income levels, right? So that's basically a way of trying to picture how much convergence there is. So what this means is that all the countries that you see on this side of the graph are those which, by 2050, will have either reached or surpassed the average OECD income level. They are those countries which are due to converge. And you can see, of course, China here. The size of the dot is GDP per capita, current. You have Peru. You have a number of countries like Kazakhstan, some surprises like Azerbaijan, for instance, and Russia. But those countries who are in this upper part of the graph are those that are not on track to converge. And here, in particular, you can see that you have South Africa, you have Brazil, you have Mexico, you have Hungary. So a number of countries which, at today's current growth rates, are not going to make it. They're not going to reach average OECD income levels by 2050. So this shifting wealth phenomenon is still ongoing, but in very different ways, depending on the countries. You may have heard that in the economic literature, there's a concept that tries to grasp a bit this phenomenon, which is called the middle income trap. Are countries, in their path of development, at some point stuck in this middle income tranche and having difficulties moving up to the high income? There's no, strong theoretical background to this. We looked in the literature very extensively, but there's nothing really telling. But what we find is that those countries who experience slowdowns in growth are mostly explained, these slowdowns, by slowdowns in productivity. So it means that there's a point in time when growth driven by accumulation of factors, labor, for instance, due to demographic growth, or capital, due to high levels of investment, are not enough to sustain the same level of development. So you're sort of reaching a bit of a plateau. It can be, for instance, the fact that in the case of the Asian economies, for instance, or some others, the boost that was provided by the demographic dividend is sort of wearing out, because the demographic dividend, that means that the moment where your population, has a very low rate of dependency, it means you have lots of active people and very few young and old people that depend on those who actually work. This demographic dividend, when populations are aging, like they are in many Asian countries, is now fading. So this is no longer a factor that supports continued growth from middle income to high income level. So it could be also the fact that the efficiency of labor is declining, because as you move on to higher stages of the value chains, you need to have more sophisticated technology. And if you can't reach that level because of the lack of innovation in particular, then the efficiency of labor sort of diminishes. So these countries have reached a level where they are now a bit stuck. They need to do something else. What do they need to do? We try to picture the extent of the gap in productivity between those countries and OECD countries in three sectors. In two sectors, manufacturing and services, and for the overall economy. And what you see here is productivity in blue in 2008 compared to productivity for those countries in 2000, expressed as a percentage of the productivity of the American economy. And as you can see, all those economies, including Korea, which we put here as a bit of a benchmark, but all those emerging economies such as Mexico, China, Brazil, Turkey, Russian Federation, India, Indonesia, are somewhere between 10 and 30% of total factor productivity of the US. So better than GDP figures that I showed earlier, this gives you an idea of the road ahead for those countries to try and catch up with the level of economic efficiency that a country like the US, for instance, has. And you can see that it's true both for manufacturing and for services. You have here China, which may be a very good performer, which has improved dramatically its productivity between 2000 and 2008, both in services and in manufacturing, but is still at close to 20% only of the manufacturing productivity of the US. I want to switch to Africa, so I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that the main factor that explains the differences between the best and the less good performers is really the difference in spending on innovation. As you can see, those who will see in the report will see that a number of countries like China are fast increasing their expenditure in research and development, but that a number of countries like Brazil, for instance, are definitely lagging behind. So now there's a need to not only try to continue on the current trend of growth, but those emerging economies need to switch to a different gear. They need to move on to more sophisticated levels of production in different sectors. They need to invest in innovation. Now, let's take a look at where Africa stands in this changing landscape. Our report, which is available outside, as we said, has documented the very good growth of Africa over the last decade. And if you look at its average growth rates for the whole continent, it's quite good. This is Africa's aggregated GDP growth between 2002 and with our forecast on to 2015. And a number of things stand out. First, the average is 5.1%. This is much better than in the 90s. This is much better than in the 80s. And that's why everybody talks about emerging Africa. The second thing that you see is that Africa was affected by our crisis, the one of OECD countries in 2009, because suddenly the price of raw materials went down, the demand for those products also went down, and African economies remain very dependent on the old world as it stands in terms of selling those goods. But it recovered very quickly, and the medium-term trend, of about 5% resumed quite well. You can see another accident here, and it will be no surprise to hear that this is due to the counter-performance of North Africa. This is the year of the Arab Spring. North Africa represents about 1/3, more or less, of the GDP of the continent. So if a country like Libya, which is a huge player in terms of oil, suddenly comes to a halt, then the whole average performance of the continent is affected. So that's what you see here. But again, big rebound. We try to remove the Libya effect, by picturing here what growth average for the continent has been without Libya. And you can see that, again, the medium-term trend is very, very solid. So that's all good news, because again, those who have known the performance of Africa in the late 20th century are very relieved to see those figures. Of course, it differs by sub-regions. You can see here the performance of North Africa, which of course has been, a bit, lots of up and downs, and that's mostly due to the fact that Libya is a bit like an oil tap, that you can turn on and off, and then GDP will fall by 60% and jump by 90%. So in terms of statistics, it doesn't mean much to reflect the real economy. But if you look at the performance of Saharan Africa, and especially the performance of Sub-Saharan Africa without South Africa, then you see that we're above the medium-term trend of the continent as a whole. And we, with our African Development Bank colleagues, we forecast that those Sub-Saharan African countries could, on average, reach growth rates of close to 7%. So this is really extremely encouraging. Just a quick look at the regional disparities that was prospects for 2013, and you can see here that West and East Africa are definitely the best performers. They remain the best performers in our forecast, for 2014. North Africa is still affected by the uncertainty, of course, on the political transitions. Now, looking quickly also, because Africa is not a country, it's 54 very different countries, at the best performers, you will not be surprised to see that most of those countries are actually relying a lot on exports of raw materials, energy, and mining. It's the case, of course, of Angola, of Mozambique, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Chad. But interestingly, there's a number of countries who have been also experiencing big rebounds after years of protracted conflict, and which have been sustaining over the last few years some very, very high growth rates. And we're particularly interested in Côte d'Ivoire these days, because we're starting a process of helping them out design their new economic strategy for the next 15 years. Interestingly enough, also, you will find two countries who are not known for their natural resource activities. That's Rwanda and Ethiopia. Now, of course, there's always a big, we can have in-depth discussions as to what the statistics really mean, but what we see here is a reflection of, in the case of Ethiopia, of a real shift in policies. The agenda of African economies these days is all about industrial policy, moving away from aid, and not looking just at the social aspects, but also transforming economies. There are a number of countries where, there are very few countries, I would say, where this is actually followed in practice by a change in the course of public policies, and I think Ethiopia is one of those. So we are looking very closely at what they're developing in terms of attracting foreign investment in manufacturing, for instance, such as in clothing, because we believe there could be a very interesting example. Bad performers, unsurprisingly, you have middle-income countries like Mauritius, South Africa, Cabo Verde, Morocco. South Africa, of course, is probably going to do far less than 2.9% this year, because of infrastructure gaps, because of probably the erosion of the political consensus model that has been in place for 20 years, whereby the type of growth that has been promoted creates insufficient employment and prevents authorities from delivering on the promises that they made at the end of apartheid. You have also badly managed economies like Swaziland and Equatorial Guinea, of course, and countries who are in the grip of very tight, very difficult, either fragility situations like Guinea-Bissau or conflict like Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea, in terms of, again, of the very difficult political situation there. I'll finish on the good news with this one. I think the State Secretary mentioned also the fact that foreign direct investment was picking up to Africa. Here you have a picture that shows the evolution from 2000 to 2014 of the different financial flows that come from outside Africa into the continent. And here in blue you have foreign direct investment. As you can see, it peaked in the mid-2000s, and then following the crisis in OECD countries, went down. It's picking up again, and we forecast that from 2014 it should become once again the main flow going to the continent. It should surpass in 2014 and beyond the flow of official development assistance. You can see here that remittances are playing an increasing role. We were quite surprised to see that remittances didn't go down after the crisis in OECD countries. You would think that migrant workers would also be affected by the crisis. But it seems that the diaspora actually, in times of crisis, tries to do even more to send money back home and make sure that their family are supported. The last thing I want to stress on this one is here. This is an expression of the total of these flows as a percentage of the GDP of African economies. And as you can see, so it's been going up, which means that until the mid-2000s, those external flows were making up an increasing share of the GDP. But since then, it's gone down and it remains pretty flat. Why? Because GDP has been growing at least as fast as external flows have been coming to the continent. This is very important because one of the key factors of growth that we've been witnessing over the last few years is led by domestic activity, not just foreign activity. And I believe that the future of Africa's economic transformation will consist in harnessing the power of African markets, country-wise and in terms of the sub-regions. Now, less good news. We have growth. We've had growth for more than 10 years now, good growth, but we don't have jobs. We looked at, we looked at official unemployment figures, but they don't help very much. If you look at official ILO unemployment figures for Burkina Faso, guess what the level of unemployment is? It's a bit less than 3%. And in the case of Cameroon, I think it's about 5 to 6%. These figures are good. They really represent what the ILO definition of unemployment actually dictates. But it doesn't help because the reality of labor markets in Africa is not the same as the reality of labor markets in OECD countries. So what we did, we worked from some polls in households to try and see how young people spend their days. What do they do? And we find out that in low-income countries in Africa, only 7% of them, of those young people aged between 15 and 24, have what you and I would call a decent job in the formal sector. Everybody else is still waiting in school to get a proper job, or has a bad job in the informal sector, or has no job at all. Some of them have discouraged, they stopped looking. Some of them never even started looking for a job. So that's the reality. And if you go to middle-income countries in Africa, it's hardly better. The share of young people who have a decent job is 10%. So we have an accumulation of wealth, but that wealth doesn't translate into jobs. And that's where the problem is. The problem is that the growth that African economies have been experiencing has made basically the cake grown bigger, but the composition of it has not changed. This is a representation of the distribution of employment by sector. So here, for instance, this green line is agriculture. You have here the share of total employment in agriculture, about 60%, okay? And then the thickness of the bar represents the overall productivity of labor. So what this shows you is that a large majority of people are employed in extremely low productivity sectors, creating very little value, earning very small wages, sometimes unpaid. And majority of them are in agriculture. You have some in trade, other services, construction. This is the average here, this gray line. Those countries that have much higher productivity, such as mining, for instance, employ very, very, very few people. So you have growth, but you don't have, what you don't see is new sectors that are more productive, that will hire more people, taking over from the old sectors like agriculture, which have very low levels of productivity. So the key question is, how do you create that? Natural resources could be an answer. They are usually described as a curse, but we don't think they need to be. Here you can see that the overall export performance of African countries, of course, is very much tied to the evolution of the energy, agriculture, mineral, and metal prices. And you can see that the share of raw materials that are unprocessed is still very high in those exports, but the green bit here shows that processed goods have been also, in absolute terms, increasing in terms of exports. So not all the news are bad from this dependency on raw materials. Besides, if you think of countries like Chile, for instance, it's still largely a raw material economy. But what they did was to make sure that they didn't depend on one. Chile started with copper, as you know. Now, the resource curse story would have been that Chile would still depend on copper, still export it without processing it, and would not, create much jobs and would not add a lot of value. Chile didn't do that, but they didn't go the Asian way. They didn't jump into manufacturing, of textiles or others to create jobs. They switched to other natural resources exploitation. So they developed their pulp industry, based on trees, and became extremely competitive at this. And then they developed wine, competing with French wines. Not in France, but in other countries, I've seen that. But you're not safe. Next thing they did, they moved into salmon. And now they're extremely competitive salmon farming economy. So the point is that natural resources are a curse if you depend on one. If you manage to diversify, it's fine. Other countries, like the OECD countries, show, like the US, for instance, show that you can use natural resources also as the basis for your economic transformation. If you look at the weight of natural resource sectors in the US or the Australian economy, in absolute terms, it keeps going up. So you don't see less of the natural resources as they develop in those countries. You see more of them. But the rest of the economy grows even faster. So their share overall diminishes. Again, abundance of natural resources is not bad. It's dependence which is bad. Of course, to benefit from natural resources, you need a number of things, and in particular, you need good infrastructure. This is a table that tries to show how much energy would be required in those countries to transform their resources of bauxite, iron, copper, and nickel locally, to process them locally instead of shipping them to foreign countries for them to be processed elsewhere. So the way you read it is this way. For instance, Botswana, to process its resources locally, its production locally, would need that level of electricity production, whereas this is the one that they produce for the economy as a whole. So the increase that would be needed in order to process those four items locally before exporting them would be 665% of the total electricity production. We were talking with the minister of Guinea, for instance, of energy and minerals, and he was saying, we have lots of bauxite, but it's not transformed into aluminium locally. But again, aluminium requires lots of energy, lots of electricity, which would be several times the current production of electricity of Guinea for the whole country. So there's two types of conclusions you can draw from this. One is infrastructure is still largely inadequate. The second one is not all natural resources should be necessarily transformed locally. You can very well benefit from having those mines, for instance, by making sure that you build linkages upstream with small and medium enterprises that become the suppliers of the big multinational investing in those sectors. But for that, you need to do what development finance institutions like Northfund are doing, try and help those entrepreneurs face to the challenges that we know very well: lack of infrastructure again, lack of access to capital. Quick word on global value chains, just to say that we've looked into our report this year on how the New Deal of world trade impacts on the opportunities for African economies. Today, about 80% of the trade in the world is related one way or another to a multinational company. So it means that most of those trade chains are organized by lead firms who are very often OECD-based, but not only, but in most cases, OECD-based multinationals that try and maximize their organization worldwide by fragmenting the process of production to different countries depending on their competitive advantages. What does that mean for Africa? So this is what we tried to look at. We saw that Africa as a whole is fairly well integrated in global value chains, as you can see, compared to other regions. But again, what you see here is that it is mostly integrated as a supplier of unprocessed raw materials. So in fact, little value is added locally, few jobs are created locally. In terms of absolute figures, what you can see here is that you may have an increase in the share, the participation of Africa in the trade in intermediate goods, but it still remains extremely, extremely low. Africa remains largely at the outskirts of the three main production hubs, which are America, Europe, and Asia. So here again, a big challenge for African economies to move up the value chain. We are sort of looking now at the same issues that I showed in the previous slides, that you need more innovation, you need to shift labor, to shift investment away from the traditional unproductive activities to new ones. And that links with the issue of the quality of the business environment. I think there's a lot to be done to make sure that Africa is not only a reservoir of raw materials that the world draws from, that it's more than a market, because that's also the good news. Africa is increasingly seen as a market, but we're still waiting to see how Africa can become a place where production actually takes place. And that, as long as infrastructure in terms of transportation, in terms of energy, will be in the current state, that is not going to be possible. I was in a Central African country for a few weeks this summer, and it's one of the countries in the world that has the most, the highest reserves of water per capita, comparable to Amazonia. And in the family I was staying with, they hadn't had water running in the pipes since the mid-70s. So it's not a question of having the resources. It's really a question of putting in place the governance that will allow economic opportunities to be seized, and allow for a consensus to be made between elites towards not just pursuing the growth path that Africa has been on for the last few years, but actually making sure that it is a transformative agenda that creates jobs for young Africans, and then make sure that the 2 billion Africans and more that will be living on the continent by 2050 have the economic and social opportunities that they're looking for. That's for the big picture. I leave it here to you, and I wish you a very good conference with more detailed discussions on what Norfund and others can do to help alleviate those problems. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henri Bernard. That was a very good introduction on the overall, and some interesting perspectives. And I think we always have to come back to this, like Africa is not one entity, the different challenges in all the different countries. And I'm sure you have to look at the challenges, both in infrastructure and other development issues in different ways in each country.
Absolutely.
But I get you right that you feel that it's a big responsibility on the governments.
Yes, we see, contrary to what people think, infrastructure spending is still largely in the hands of governments. 100% almost of the expenditure on maintenance in particular is in the hands of governments, and we know that that's where the problem is. I was telling you about this African country I was in for the last few months. The Chinese built on behalf of the government a road, from the main harbor into the country, which was largely overdue. But instead of putting 30 centimeters of tar, because some money had evaporated, they built 12 centimeters. So 2 years later, you have to redo it all over again. So it's not just putting the money for investment. Maintenance is also a key issue.
And you mentioned the Chinese. When we look at we see the increase in foreign direct investment. Is that a lot from China as well?
It is, but if you consider Europe as one entity, it's still largely the main partner, both in terms of trade and even more in terms of investment.
And also in infrastructure?
In infrastructure, you can see the share of China rising rapidly, but I can share with you and with all of you a paper that has the figures, and you show that Europeans are not going anywhere. They're still extremely present in the sector.
It's very interesting. Thanks again, and give him a big hand. And the report is available